done any talks in a while up here. I just wanted to make sure that everything worked, that I could sign on and stuff. I told you earlier, this came out of his lab. He invented linear regression. This is the first regression line. Another guy worked in his lab by the name of Pearson. Some of you may have heard of the Pearson's correlation coefficient. They worked out this science while working on the problem of what they termed alien immigration into Great Britain. And this came along with the notion of racial hygiene. This is the notion that humankind is divided into different races. And I would put races in quotation marks because the term race didn't mean the same thing then as it does now. But the idea was that you could divide races by their abilities, by their intelligence, by their behavioral characteristics, and construct a table from top to bottom. And somehow the people at the top always turned out to be the people who were designing this scientific theory. It's important to realize this was mainstream science. Charles Davenport, who founded Cold Spring Harbor, and those of you who do mouse research know that Cold Spring Harbor is still a major center for American genetics. This is what he had to say about immigration. And as you read this, you can wonder if perhaps you could hear this being said in contemporary times. He said, the great influence of blood from southeastern Europe will rapidly make the American population darker in pigmentation, smaller in stature, more mercurial, more given to crimes of larceny, kidnapping, assault, murder, rape, and sex immorality. Again, I emphasize this is a scientist of enormous repute at the time. And this then helped to create the notion of scientific racism and the idea that diseases were different in different races. The Oslo study of syphilis was performed from 1890 to 1910. This is that study. For those of you who are fluent in Norwegian can read along. This was a retrospective study, and it looked at people in Norway. Norway is a beautiful country. Norway is a lovely country. Norway is an extraordinarily white country. And this was what we knew at the time about the natural history of syphilis. So the Public Health Service said, let's find out what the natural history of syphilis is in African American men. And they recruited 600 people, 400 people with syphilis, 200 others to serve as controls. This is the church in Tuskegee, Alabama, from which many of these men were recruited. The ideas that drove them to this study were astoundingly racist. And I'm just going to give you a touch because it's hard to talk about, frankly. This is a letter to the Mayo Clinic, and I'm going to focus in, but the purpose of showing you the original letter is that this wasn't some people in a back room talking over a beer and a cigar. This was an official letter typed and sent to another doctor. This was from the Public Health Service. And he's explaining why they went to Tuskegee. And what he says, as you can see here, he says, this state of affairs is due to the paucity of doctors, rather low intelligence of the Negro population in this section, depressed economic conditions, and the very common promiscuous sex relations of this population group, which not only contribute to the spread of syphilis, but also contribute to the prevailing indifference with regards to treatment. So he's basically saying that the people who live in and around Tuskegee are promiscuous and they don't really care if they get syphilis. Another Public Health Service physician said about this, so the scourge sweeps among them. Those that are treated are only half cured, and the effort to assimilate a complex civilization drives their diseased minds until the results are criminal records. He went on to say, perhaps here, in conjunction with tuberculosis, will be the end of the Negro problem. The point here is that the people who were doing this study came to it with profoundly racist ideas about African Americans in the United States. So the people who were selected for this study in Nature were not told that they had syphilis. It was originally intended to last 6 months, but the study was extended to look at autopsy findings. Every few months or so, a group of white doctors from Washington, D.C. would come down, round up 600 men, bring them in for physical exams and laboratory studies. And this is another picture similar to the first one that I showed you, showing the blood being drawn from a man out in the field. And there has developed, in part because of these pictures, what I think is a myth, the idea that the men were intentionally infected with syphilis. I do not believe that's so. I think the historical record clearly shows that it's not so, but it continues to be something that people are worried about. One of the unfortunate elements of this study involves this lady on the right. Her name is Eunice Rivers. She was from Macon County and she worked with the study. She went to nursing school at the Tuskegee Institute. This is a picture of Tuskegee Institute Nursing School. I wish I could tell you that Nurse Rivers was in this picture. She's not. It's hard to say too many good things about the Tuskegee Institute. It was literally the only place in the Deep South where African American people could get any sort of a graduate education. All of the other schools were closed to them. But the Tuskegee Institute was a diamond in South Alabama that was widely respected both locally and nationally. There's a couple of ironies here. One is, why do we know the name of Nurse Rivers and yet not the names of the men who actually ran this study? And I appreciate Susan Wolford, who had that insight when we were preparing for this talk. That had never occurred to me, but I think it's really profound that is true. You might wonder what she might have done about this. Consider this: she was triply marginalized. She was African American, she was a nurse, she was a woman. The study is being run out of Washington, D.C. by the Public Health Service. What could she do? Who could she blow the whistle to that would do anything about it? Here you see a picture, again, showing the rural South, the red clay, the scrub brush, the trees, low trees, car on a dusty road. The United States Public Health Service went to great lengths to make sure that the men would not be treated, even with the rather ineffectual treatments available at the time. It's really hard to keep a secret. And one of the men heard about what was going on and got on a bus and rode it to Birmingham, Alabama, and went to a public health clinic to try to get treated for a syphilis. However, the people running the study heard that he was on his way, called ahead, and prevented him from being treated. Let me put that in more blunt terms. The United States Public Health Service actively prevented someone from getting treatment at a public health clinic because they were in a study. One of the areas that was affected by syphilis, was known to be affected at the time, and we know today as well, is the central nervous system. And here you see one of the men being prepared for a lumbar puncture, which was done periodically. This was not a benign procedure in those days. In order to do the necessary testing, they had to withdraw a lot more fluid than we do today. And thus there were a lot more side effects that came from lumbar punctures. This is one of the more horrific documents, because this is a lie. If you look at the top and see, where is this letter from? It's from the Macon County Health Department, the Alabama State Board of Health, the United States Public Health Service, and the Tuskegee Institute. That is 4 of the most respected health institutions in the area. It's your county health department, it's your state health department, it's your national health department, and it's the Tuskegee Institute. And it is a lie, because it talks about getting a second examination and how you're going to get a special treatment if you believed you're in a condition to stand it. It says, this is your last chance for special free treatment. Be sure to meet the nurse. This was a lie. There was no treatment. This was to induce the men to come in and get a lumbar puncture. And this is a picture of the Tuskegee Institute, founded in 1881 by Booker T. Washington to educate freed slaves. The men who passed away had their autopsies done at the Tuskegee Institute. Again, you can wonder if they felt like they had the ability to say no. They were also getting considerable federal funds, and what would happen if they turned down a request by the federal government to help them. Here you see a few of the men who were involved in the study. And you can see them marked as subject or control. So, the Public Health Service is tracking men with syphilis, not treating them. Starts in the 1932. You might wonder, when did the study end? What caused it to end? And there are a number of places. First of all, I said there wasn't very effective treatment for syphilis. At the time, there wasn't. But as many of you know, in St. Mary's Hospital in London, a gentleman named Alexander Fleming was doing a laboratory experiment and had some petri dishes with bacteria. He left them out over the weekend, came back in and found some mold growing in his petri dishes that had wiped out all the bacteria. He didn't do what I would have done, many of you might have done, which is to utter a few curse phrases and throw the petri dishes away and start over with the experiment. Instead, he said, what is this fungus what is this mold that's wiping out the bacteria? And you, of course, know the answer is it's penicillin. And so it took a while to figure out how to make penicillin in mass quantities, but we did. And we discovered that, among other things, penicillin was at the time exquisitely effective at treating syphilis and gonorrhea. And certainly by the mid-1940s, it was absolutely standard treatment for venereal disease and incredibly effective. Here you see a pharmacy talking about how they have penicillin in stock. So it's the United States Public Health Service. We got a bunch of men with syphilis. We didn't have a good way of treating them before. Now we do. Pretty simple, right? Call them up, bring them in. You're seeing them every few months anyway. Give them a couple shots of penicillin and treat them. That's not what happened. You might have thought that this would have ended with the ethics revolution that came about as a result of the Second World War. As many of you know, during the Second World War, there were some horrific experiments performed in the Holocaust, in the camps. There was a show trial held in Nuremberg. The United States essentially ran the trial along with Great Britain. Leading physicians were brought up on charges of war crimes. Many of them were found guilty. Some of them were sentenced to death. So prominent medical school professors were hanged for conducting unethical experimentation. And out of this came a code of ethics known as the Nuremberg Code, named after the city in which the trials took place. And the first Nuremberg Code in 1949, this was widely publicized. This was front page news. Said the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. There should be made known to him the nature, duration, and purpose of the experiment and the effects upon his health or person which may possibly come from his participation in the experiment. Clearly, this Tuskegee experiments do not meet this standard. The men are not told what's going on. They're not told what the effects of untreated syphilis might be. So maybe when this code came out, somebody would have said, hey, we're doing these experiments. But now that we have a new code of ethics, we got to stop. It didn't happen. Maybe the problem was nobody knew about this. Maybe if only people had known what was going on, this could not have been sustained. I'm sorry to tell you that's not true either. The study started in 1932. The first report was published 4 years later in 1936. Maybe it was published somewhere obscure. Maybe it was published somewhere where nobody would see it or know about it. No. This was presented at the annual meeting of the American Medical Association. Can you think of a more high-profile place to present this than the annual meeting of the American Medical Association? And who presented it? An assistant surgeon general, a medical director, and an assistant surgeon of the United States Public Health Service. And what is the title? Untreated Syphilis in the Male Negro, a comparative study of treated and untreated cases. There's no attempt to obfuscate. There's no hiding what's going on. They're right out front saying this is what we're doing and presenting it to the American Medical Association. And over and over and over again, for the next few decades, they published papers about what they were finding. Here's another one, untreated syphilis in the male Negro, 22 years in this case of serological observation in a selected syphilis group. And these papers went everywhere. These were published in the Archives of Internal Medicine. These were published in journals that went to every single medical school in this country. That includes the University of Michigan, it includes Harvard, it includes Stanford, it includes Meharry, it includes every medical school in the country and every physician pretty much in the country. This was never a secret. And you know what they discovered? This will blow you away. They discovered that if you don't treat somebody with syphilis, they die sooner. Isn't that amazing? They die sooner. And they were fined as time went on. They defined exactly how much untreated syphilis in the male Negro reduced your life expectancy. You can find many of these papers. Here's on the 30th years of observation. They stated that these men offered an unusual opportunity, one wonders for whom, and revised the previous estimate of the decrease of life expectancy from 17% to 20%. That's what they were doing this for. So you could know that it's not a 17% decrease in life expectancy, but it's 20%. That's what these men were discovering literally with their lives. As a member of the panel later convened to review the study said, they proved a point, then they proved a point, then they proved a point. Participation was not totally without its rewards. Here you see a certificate that was given by the Surgeon General to men who had survived 25 years of tertiary syphilis without penicillin. Pretty meager for the consequences of untreated tertiary syphilis, consequences that these men were literally proving with their lives. Surely this would have ended with the Civil Rights Movement. This is the 1963 March on Washington. The Civil Rights Movement was not a little blip. I was alive during the Civil Rights Movement. I was living in Columbus, Mississippi, 12 miles from the Alabama border. You did not miss the Civil Rights Movement. You did not fail to notice that something was going on. Surely somebody in the CDC, one of the hundreds of medical students who was there, would have said, wait a second, what are we doing? How can we be doing this? I want to take a moment and acknowledge a politician and civil rights leader who died a few weeks ago, John Lewis. He's kneeling in front of a segregated swimming pool while people shouted and harassed the activists. He was part of this movement as well. Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech in Washington. Well, some people were paying attention, not many, but some. And one guy wrote a letter to the head of CDC, basically saying, what in the bleep are you doing with this study? This can't be right. And so the head of the CDC did what every good administrator does when confronted with a problem like this, which is, of course, he formed a committee. And the committee sat down, and this is, again, one of these can you believe it moments. They formed a committee to consider whether or not to continue the study in 1969. Some of you on this webinar were not alive in 1969. I realize that. Some of us were. I was alive, I was in high school, I was around. And it's almost unbelievable that you could form a committee and consider the study. Historians like documents. This is the actual memo that was distributed for people who met at the CDC. This is a classification of cases in the Tuskegee study. Shows the controls, the syphilitic, and the total, the number who are alive, the number who are dead. And they sat down and they said, yeah, let's continue it. They said, you'll never have another opportunity like this. We need to go on. We need to continue with the study. In another setting, not this one, but I think very tellingly, one public health service physician said, and I quote, "We have no further interest in these men until they die." We have no further interest in these men until they die. One physician voted against it, one member of the committee, Gene Stollerman, I'll give his name because I give him credit for that, as chair of the Department of Internal Medicine at the University of Tennessee, said we should stop the experiment, but all the others voted to continue, and so they continued. The experiment finally ended in 1972 when a CDC employee named Peter Buxton told the Associated Press what was going on. A study broke all around the country. This is the Wire Service message on the 26th of July, 1972. And it's a pretty accurate description. It said, for 40 years, the United States Public Health Service has conducted a study in which human beings with syphilis who were induced to serve as guinea pigs have gone without medical treatment for the disease, and a few have died of its late effect, even though an effective therapy was eventually discovered. And this is what it looked like on the front page of the New York Times. And because we live in a bureaucracy, like everything else, the formal ending of the study came with a memo. And this is the actual memo from the director to the assistant secretary saying the termination of the study. At the time the study ended, 74 study subjects were still alive. At least 28, possibly as many as 100, had died from syphilis. This is one of many cartoons that came out at the time. This shows a gentleman lying in bed, the blankets being pulled up over his head because he's just passed away. The sign that is on his bed says, "Ignore this syphilis patient, experiment in progress." The nurse is holding a syringe in her hands, and she says, now we can give him penicillin. In 1974, a class action lawsuit was settled. 70 survivors got $37,500 each. The families of those who died got $15,000. 22 wives, 17 children, and 2 grandchildren were awarded lifetime medical benefits as a result of this lawsuit. I'll leave to you to consider the irony that in many countries in this world, being a citizen of the country gives you lifetime medical benefits. In this case, they were awarded as part of a lawsuit. The final report was a whitewash, literally. The Public Health Service, with a straight face, admitted that the men had been deceived and denied treatment for 39 years, but they insisted that there was nothing racial about the study. A Senate hearing led to a National Commission on Bioethics, Any of you that have filled out an IRB, IRBs came as a direct result of the Senate committee's creation of the National Commission on Bioethics, which recommended institutional review boards as a means of preventing anything like Tuskegee from happening again. We can consider, maybe discuss in the Q&A if it really would, if IRBs really would prevent Tuskegee. I'll simply ask you to perform a mind experiment, roll the tape back to 1932 when the experiment starts, and ask yourself, would an IRB have prevented it from happening? I think it's extremely unlikely. 1997 was a remarkable event. The President of the United States apologized. And we all know the non-apology apology that we too often hear. You know, the apology that says, I'm sorry if what I said bothered you, or I'm sorry if you were troubled by what happened. This wasn't one of those apologies. Here's President Clinton at the meeting, and this is a news report on the apology, but I want to have you hear and read what he actually said. He said, to the survivors, to the wives and family members, the children and the grandchildren, I say what you know. No power on earth can give you back the lives lost, the pain suffered, the years of internal torment and anguish. What was done cannot be undone, but we can end the silence. We can stop turning our heads away. We can look at you in the eye and finally say, on behalf of the American people, what the United States government did was shameful, and I am sorry. What the United States government did was shameful. I wholeheartedly agree. This is Herman Shaw. He was one of the few survivors who could made it up for the Clinton apology. Most of them had passed away. Those that were alive, most of them were not in shape to make the trip to DC. At the event, he talked about a number of things. He talked about how much he loved farming. He couldn't wait to get back on his 56-year-old tractor and get back to the farm. But as to whether or not this was racist, he said, you know, this was racist. They only used colored people. This is one of the men from the study out on his farm. So what difference does this make? Why are you taking almost an hour out of your day to hear about the Tuskegee experiments? Well, I would argue that it matters deeply today for a number of reasons. And let me hit lightly on some of them and try to make sure we have some time for discussion. First of all, some of you may have noted we're living through a pandemic. I don't need to point out, I think, to this group the devastating impact that COVID-19 has had specifically on African Americans. This is evidence, if we needed any, of structural racism and of the devastating impact of structural racism on the health of people of color. This just shows you that it's true in Louisiana, it's true in Michigan, disproportionately killing Black people. These are specifically from Michigan. 34% of the cases, as of the time of these statistics, were in Black or African American people, 40% of those who have died. So the same structural racism that created Tuskegee continues to exist today and continues to have tangible effects on health. This is just to show you that the same thing is happening in Alabama, which should not come as any surprise. But what about the effect of Tuskegee on people's ideas about health and medicine? The New York Times did a poll, and it was a few years ago, but I think it speaks to what we're talking about. The poll said some people think the virus which causes AIDS was deliberately created in a laboratory in order to infect Black people. Do you think this might be true? It is true, or it's almost certainly not true. And the similar polls have been done nationally over the years, and they all come up with roughly the same numbers. These are the numbers of this New York Times poll, which you see is among white people, nobody thinks it's true. Now, 5% think it's true or might possibly be true. Among Black people, 10% say it's true, 19% say it might possibly be true. That's 29%. That's almost a third. Almost a third think that it's true or might be true. Now, let me be clear. I do not think that it's true. But I think that if you know what happened in Tuskegee, it's not irrational to wonder if this might be true. And I think that we as healthcare providers need to understand when our patients don't trust us, that they have good reasons not to trust us, that we need to work to try to enable that trust. I think so that we can, in many cases, do things that will in fact save their lives. And one of the things that we know saves lives, there's not a lot of things we do in medicine that we know save lives. And one of them is immunizations and vaccination. And I'll touch on COVID in a second, but we have data to show what happens with other vaccinations. Flu vaccination rates, 40% among white people, 28% among Black people. Why? Part of this is a lack of trust. Part of this is a lack of not believing that what we're offering them is in fact going to help. Sorry for the low quality of this slide, but this just shows this has been persistent over time. Top line is non-Hispanic white. This man is not Hispanic Black. Seasonal influenza vaccinations, consistently lower in African American people. And we know statistically over the population, this means that African American people are dying because they're not getting vaccinated, in part because they don't trust the system. Tuskegee is part of this. I went briefly online. Unfortunately, it does not take long to come up with these things. Black history fact. Stop trusting Caucasians. Ain't no good white folks. Again, with one of the pictures of the man and the needle. Here's one that says they gave African-American vaccines secretly tainted with syphilis, but lied to them, telling them that they were receiving health care. They all died. This is not true as far as we know. They were not secretly given syphilis. But I think if you know what happened, and you see pictures like the one I started with, like this one, and you're not familiar with people drawing blood, it's not hard to believe that these men are being injected with syphilis. And this is a pernicious myth that makes it all the way, it was in the New York Times on Sunday. There's a recent book called The Oregon Thieves. It's Oregon, O-R-G-E-N, not Oregon. The Oregon Thieves, which tells the story of Bruce Tucker. Bruce Tucker was an African-American gentleman whose heart was donated at the Medical College of Virginia to save a white businessman. His heart was donated without anybody bothering to contact his family, even though he had a business card in his pocket. And this is the subject of a new book, which sounds like in some respects it's a very good book, but this book, again, perpetuates the myth that the people were being injected with syphilis during the course of the Tuskegee experiments. I don't know what's going to happen with the COVID vaccine. I'm worried about it. There was an article this morning in the paper. Walter Kimbrough, who's the president of Dillard University, and C. Reynold Verrett, who's the president of Xavier University. Both of those are historically Black colleges located in New Orleans, Louisiana, volunteered to be subjects in the vaccine trials. And then Walter Kimbrough sent out a message encouraging students at Dillard University to also volunteer for the vaccine trials. He's getting incredible heat for people that basically wonder if he's getting paid to encourage people to volunteer for the trials, who wonder if this is using people as guinea pigs. He points out, I think appropriately, more people are dying from COVID who are African American. We don't know how the vaccine is going to work in African Americans. If we don't have African Americans volunteering for the trials, then we're going to know less when the vaccine actually goes live. But I think it's interesting that somebody who's a leader in the community who suggests participating in these studies is getting a fair amount of heat. I'll leave it to read you You can read this. U.S. government offers free health care to Southern rural blacks, intentionally injects them with syphilis, still want a corona vaccine. People are going to die because they don't trust the system. There are reasons not to trust it. I don't think giving them syphilis is one of them. I have some additional evidence, which I'm going to just touch on very lightly. Healthcare utilizations, a study done by the through the National Health Interview Survey data, showing a drop-off in people seeing physicians after the study results were released in 1972. It's a very sophisticated study. It was more, the closer you were to Alabama, the more likely you were to see a drop-off, and it was true of men and not women. We can talk more about that. So, this is what happened in the Tuskegee experiments. One could logically, these are all men who were involved. You've seen one of their pictures before. My good friend Vanessa Gamble has asked, what's Tuskegee got to do with it? The inherent structural racism that is baked into the system was certainly the cause of the Tuskegee experiments, but the lack of trust would exist even without Tuskegee. If Tuskegee had never happened, we would still have the same kinds of problems with structural racism today that we did then. This is a picture of the men lined up in front of a general store in Davisville, just south of Tuskegee. I told you there was always a dog. Here's a dog. Could an experiment like Tuskegee happen again today? I'll let you think about that. We can potentially discuss it. After the experiments, a new chapel was built in Tuskegee. This is the interior of that chapel. I think one of the lessons is that we have to always see our patients in the larger context, and that context includes history, and unfortunately the history of racism. But let me leave you with a quote, again from John Lewis, recently passed away. This is from 2018. He tweeted, "Do not get lost in a sea of despair. Be hopeful, be optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the struggle of a lifetime. Never ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble." So I thank you for your attention. I encourage all of you to get into necessary trouble, and I would welcome any discussion that people want to have.
Thank you very much, Joel. If people do have questions, please put them either in the chat box or in the question and answer box, and we will post those to Dr. Howell. Certainly the question and answer box might be the easier way to go, but please pick either one. Joel, while we're waiting for any questions to come in, I'd like to start us off by asking whether or not any of the people who directed this study, once it came out and once it was public, ever suffered any either criminal or professional consequences for what they had done?
They did not suffer any criminal consequences. They tended to keep their heads down. Most of them were getting fairly up in years. They didn't suffer any official professional consequences. Their license weren't yanked. One of them had his name put on a building at the University of Pittsburgh School of Public Health, and it was recently removed, not only for Tuskegee, but also because he was involved in experiments down in Guatemala, in which they actually did intentionally infect people with syphilis. But alas, the kinds of consequences you might want to see did not occur.
And that was because there was no notion of accountability? I guess I'm just kind of struggling to be able to understand.
This is speculation, and your speculation is probably as good as mine, but I think that unfortunately the rationale that was used, these men weren't going to get treated anyway. Subtext, they were African-American men whose bodies were to some extent seen as disposable. that racism did not go away in 1972 when the study was ended.
Okay. There's a question in the chat box that just asks if this is recorded, and will the presentation be available later to others? The answer is yes. The presentation is being recorded and will be on the department's website. Go ahead.
Gary, let me challenge listeners. Do you think this could happen again? Is it happening again? Can you point to examples today where you think something is happening that is Tuskegee-like?
Well, there's a question now in the question and answer. It says, speaking of institutionalized racism, can you comment on Victor Vaughn's connection with Kellogg and his views on eugenics and race?
I certainly can. And out of respect for my distinguished colleague, I did not correct the introduction. I can not only comment it, I can tell you that as of a couple of years ago, my chair was originally named Victor Vaughn. At my request, it is no longer the Victor Vaughn chair. I am now the Elizabeth Farron chair, and made the decision to divest myself of that name. So yes, Victor Vaughn was dean of the medical school. He was also an avowed eugenicist. And as that became more and more apparent, I just thought that it was less and less good that his name should be on a celebratory chair. So.
Thank you. I stand corrected. We have someone who's written both in, one person in the Q&A and one person in the chat. When you asked about whether or not things could happen again, both of them commented on the doctor from ICE who did a hysterectomy on someone in Georgia and why there is so little outcry right now. For those in the audience who aren't familiar necessarily with that, could you just briefly speak to the situation and then what your thoughts are on the question?
Well, my thoughts are the obvious thoughts, which is this is absolutely horrible, and there should be consequences for behaving like that. I would just point out that sterilization was a key part of the eugenical situation. Let's just go back for a second. Buck versus Bell was a case in the United States in the 1920s of Carrie Buck, who was the daughter of a feeble-minded mother and herself the parent of a feeble-minded child. These are the terms that were used at the time. Her case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in an 8-to-1 decision, and I quote, that 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And sterilizing people against their will to prevent them from passing on bad genes was in fact legal in the United States and was done all over the country, including, I'm sorry to say, at the University of Michigan. This continued on well after that. There was what was called the Mississippi appendectomy, which referred to physicians in the state of Mississippi and probably other states as well, who in the course of performing an appendectomy on somebody who they did not think should have children, would also tie the tubes and render them infertile. So what's happening at ICE is very much in that same idea that these are women who are not human, who do not have rights, who ought not reproduce, and I will take the authority as the physician, as their superior, to decide that they will no longer be able to have children. It's absolutely horrible. It's got a long history.
Someone has asked, is Victor Vaughn's name on any buildings at the University of Michigan right now?
Yes, it is. There's the Victor Vaughn building, which as far as I know is still the Victor Vaughn building. To be honest, I haven't been past there in a while, so I haven't looked to see if any of the things changed.
Okay. Another one of the attendees has commented that, in answer to your question, that absolutely, that things like this still can happen, and they cite the treatment of African-American women within the hospital setting and the higher, I'm guessing, maternal mortality rate exceeding others is a sign of that.
Yeah, and also infant mortality rates. And what's, I'm doing another research project somewhat unrelated to this, looking at the history of guidelines for prenatal care. And I got to confess, I was surprised when I found the 1915 paper out of Johns Hopkins University that calls out specifically the fact that what they term Negro mothers, African-American mothers, and their infants had a much higher mortality rate, double that of white people. So when I see this from 100 years ago, over 100 years ago, coming from a distinguished institution, it's shocking to say this isn't hot news. I mean, my answer to the question that was asked is yes, you're right. But what's troubling as a historian is that we've known this. We've known this for literally a century or more. And yet we haven't bothered to get our act together enough to do what needs to be done to make things better.
The next question is, was there a reason why women weren't targeted in the Tuskegee experiment?
That's a really good question. This is a highly gendered story. I mean, they were not subjects. You might momentarily stop and think about what does a public health service do today? If you show up at the door of a public health clinic and have a venereal disease, the first question they ask is, who were your contacts? And let's go track them down and treat them. In this case, the public health service knew of 400 men who had syphilis and made zero attempt to track down any of their partners. And so those are also victims of the experiments in ways that have not been thoroughly explored. I think that the reasons they looked only at men, like so much of this experiment, were grounded in some pretty racist ideas about sexuality in African-American men.
We are approaching the end of our hour. I want to thank Dr. Howell, not the Victor Vaughn professor, for
Elizabeth Farrand.
Elizabeth Farrand professor. And thank you very, very much for sharing your words with us today. I do want to remind everyone that this is an ongoing series. This is now the second of our forums on racism and justice, and that it'll be the third Tuesday of every month, like we said, and we will look forward to seeing you at our next forum. I do want to leave everyone with one more question for us all to ponder that is in the Q&A box, and that is, why is it so hard to speak up in the present moment? So let us all ponder that, and let us all think about how we can speak up to end racism and to promote justice in all of our lives. So thank you, Joel, and thank you, Susan, and thank all of you for attending.